Did you know the placenta is the only disposable organ? It is. In fact, it's the only organ that is naturally expelled whenever its function or purpose is already done. And every time a woman gets pregnant, she grows a new placenta to support the baby. Multitasking is not new to us, but have you ever heard of an organ that does multitasking? That would be the placenta for you. It serves as the fetus lungs, it serves as the fetus kidneys, and even gastrointestinal and immune system all in one. Given how awesome the placenta is, we are going to highlight this organ in this lecture by discussing the components of the placenta and its functions. We will also describe the different fetal membranes and consider some of the clinical correlates. Remember that the growth of the fetus and the size at birth must depend on the delivery of sufficient nutrients and oxygen to the placenta from maternal circulation. But how is the placenta formed and what is it composed of? The placenta is composed of a fetal portion and a maternal part. The fetal portion would be the trophoblast, the chorionic plate, particularly the chorion frondosum, and for the maternal part, it consists of the endometrium, particularly the decidua basalis. Let's take a closer look at the fetal portion of the placenta. This is the end of the third week. Notice that the tertiary and secondary stem villi give the trophoblast a characteristic radial appearance. Intervillous spaces, which are found throughout the trophoblast, are lined with syncytium and are filled with maternal blood. The cytotrophoblastic cells surround the trophoblast entirely and are in direct contact with the endometrium. At this stage, the embryo is still suspended in the chorionic cavity by means of a connecting stalk. As the fetus grows, the villi on the embryonic pole continue to grow and expand, giving rise to the chorion frondosum, otherwise known as the bushy chorion. On the embryonic pole, the villi degenerate so that by the end of third month, the chorion on that side appears smooth, and that's the chorion lave. The maternal portion of the placenta is derived from the decidua basalis. In this figure, the decidua projects into the intervillous spaces, forming the decidual septa, which divides the placenta into compartments called cotyledons. Notice how these septa do not reach the chorionic plate. This only means that communication between intervillous spaces is still possible. Let's take a closer look at the functional layer of the endometrium, which is the decidua. This is the layer that is shed off during parturition. The decidua basalis at the embryonic pole comes in contact with the chorion frondosum. The decidua basalis is actually the maternal portion of the placenta, while the chorion frondosum is the fetal part. The decidua capsularis at the embryonic pole stretches as the fetus grows until eventually it degenerates and is no longer seen in figure B. Meanwhile, the decidua paritalis eventually fuses with a smooth chorion or chorion leaf and obliterates the uterine lumen as seen in figure B. So let's talk about placental circulation. How does placental circulation occur? At full term, the placenta is discoid with a diameter of 15 to 25 centimeters. It is approximately 3 centimeters thick and weighs around 500 to 600 grams. Now, at birth, it will be torn from the uterine wall, and approximately 30 minutes after the birth of the child, it will be expelled from the uterine cavity as the afterbirth. The placenta is viewed from the maternal side, having areas that bulges, and we call this the cotyledons. The cotyledon is covered by a thin layer of Deciduous Basalis, and the grooves between the cotyledons are formed by the Decidua septa, here labeled as placental septum. The fetal surface of the placenta, on the other hand, is covered entirely by the chorionic plate. And notice that a large number of arteries and veins, the chorionic vessels, would converge towards the umbilical cord here. Let's talk about maternal circulation. But first, let's be oriented with the important structures here. In pink, you have the spiral endometrial arteries, and in blue, you have the endometrial veins. These here are the different chorionic villi, whereby the smallest villi branching out from the stem villi is what you call as the branch villi. Of course, the different blood vessels from the villi will collect here, and it will enter this umbilical cord, where you will find the umbilical arteries and the umbilical veins. And so let's begin. The pressure in the spiral endometrial arteries forces the maternal blood to flow into the intervillous spaces, bathing the branch villi. These branch villi, as I mentioned, actually arise from the stem villi, and it is here that the main exchange of metabolic and gaseous products with the fetal blood occurs. The inflowing arterial blood pushes venous blood out of the intervillous space and into the endometrial veins, which are, as you can see, scattered over the surface of the Deciduous Basalis. So the spiral arteries we mentioned earlier are actually structurally transformed during pregnancy in order to increase blood flow about, say, 100-fold. And this arterial transformation is dependent on an unusual process during placentation, whereby the fetal trophoblast cells from the placenta will infiltrate the uterine wall. It will home to the arteries and destroy the smooth muscle media of the arteries. Because of the modification caused by the trophoblast, the arteries become conduits capable of high conductance at low pressure, with a reduction in velocity of the blood entering the placenta. Terminal dilation of the arteries will also result in further reduction in the flow rate into the intervillous space. This is important because somehow it will allow enough time for gas exchange to happen, especially towards the end of the pregnancy when the fetus will demand oxygen most. Now, notice how dilated the arteries are. in normal pregnancy and compare that with the arteries that did not dilate properly here. So whenever there is failure of the arterial conversion by trophoblast, then arterial blood will jet into the intervillous space from the non-transformed arteries. And because of the pressure created there, it will damage the villus tree. Transport of oxygen and nutrients to the fetus will also be reduced, and this is actually manifested as fetal growth restriction in severe cases. And in more severe cases, the mother may develop preeclampsia, which is a systemic syndrome that occurs when the placenta becomes stressed as a result of reduced blood flow. There are soluble factors released from the stressed placenta, and it can trigger inflammatory conditions resulting to diverse clinical manifestations. Example, there could be edema, proteinuria, high blood pressure, and this can even progress into eclampsia and may even lead to maternal death. This is one of the principal reasons for clinical problems in both mothers and babies in pregnancies with very low birth weights. So there are complications that are associated with it. So you could now see how important the development of the placenta is so that you will end up with a healthy pregnancy and a healthy fetus. Let's talk about fetal circulation. The umbilical arteries carry poorly oxygenated fetal blood, shown in blue, to the placenta. And the umbilical vein carries oxygen-rich blood to the fetus, and this is shown in red. Now, direct your attention to the umbilical arteries and notice that it divides into chorionic arteries that branch freely in the chorionic plate, forming the arteriocapillary venous system. Let's take a closer look at the arteriocapillary venous system. So in figure A, you see a drawing of a stem chorionic villus showing its arteriocapillary venous system. The arteries, remember, carry poorly oxygenated fetal blood and waste products from the fetus, while the veins would carry oxygenated or oxygen-rich blood and nutrients going to the fetus. Now in figure B and C, these are actually cross-sections through the branch villus at 10 weeks and full term respectively. So the placenta membrane is composed of extrafetal tissues that are separated from the maternal blood in the intervillous space from fetal blood in the capillaries in the villi. Note that the placental membrane becomes very thin at full term. So the placental membrane is a thin membrane consisting of the syncytial trophoblast that is in direct contact with the fetal capillary endothelium. And take note, it is not a barrier. In fact, most drugs and other substances can pass through the placental membrane. So there really are a lot of substances, both beneficial and harmful, that can cross the placental membrane. So all of these can enter fetal circulation. So these can be carried by the endometrial spiral arteries and bring it now to the intervillous space. Notice that the placental membrane is only a very thin membrane here, separating the intervillous space with the maternal blood there and the fetal capillary that contains fetal blood and serum. So it is in this placental membrane that exchange of materials will take place. So these materials that I highlighted earlier will cross through the placental membrane and into fetal capillary and will be brought towards the fetus via the umbilical vein, which is found actually in the umbilical cord. Now, waste products or metabolic waste materials from the fetus, on the other hand, is carried by the umbilical arteries and it enters the fetal capillary and it can cross this thin placental membrane and go into the intervillous space, and from there it goes out of the placenta and enters maternal circulation via the endometrial veins. So what are the functions of the placenta? Remember how we said that the placenta is awesome because it performs a lot of functions? One of the functions it does would be the exchange of gases like oxygen, carbon dioxide, and even carbon monoxide, which is harmful. And all of these is actually accomplished by simple diffusion. Now, the exchange of nutrients and electrolytes like amino acids, free fatty acids, carbohydrates, and vitamins is also rapid, and it increases as the pregnancy advances because the fetus would require more of this. Maternal antibodies are also transmitted and can pass through the placenta. And these are very important so that it will give the fetus passive immunity against various infectious diseases. Newborns begin to produce their own maternal immunoglobulin G, but adult levels are not attained until the age of 3. When it comes to production of hormones, by the end of the 4th month, the placenta produces progesterone. Remember, progesterone is important so that it can maintain the lining of the uterus, preventing it from being shed off and therefore preventing miscarriage. Another important hormone would be the estrogenic hormones, predominantly the estriol. And just before the end of pregnancy, maximum levels of estriol is reached, and these high levels of estrogen are crucial to stimulate uterine growth as well as the development of the mammary glands. And take note, towards the first 2 months of pregnancy, the syncytial trophoblast produces the human chorionic gonadotropin or the HCG. This maintains the corpus luteum. This hormone can be secreted by the mother in the urine, and in the early stages of gestation, you can determine if a woman is pregnant or not by detecting the presence of HCG. Now, what about the amnion? So the amnion is a thin membrane that surrounds the fetus. Within the cavity of the amnion are amniotic fluid. But did you know that the water content of amniotic fluid changes every 3 hours? This is very important because amniotic fluid is swallowed by the fetus and is eventually absorbed by the fetus' respiratory and digestive tract and therefore enters fetal circulation. The growing fetus is found within the amnion. Its cavity is filled with around 800 to 1000 ml of amniotic fluid at 37 weeks. From the beginning of 5th month, the fetus swallows around 400 ml of amniotic fluid. The amniotic fluid is very important for several reasons. First, it permits symmetrical external growth of the embryo and the fetus. It acts as barrier to infection. It permits normal fetal breathing. It prevents adherence of the amnion to the embryo. It cushions the embryo and the fetus. It helps control embryo's body temperature, and it enables free movement and homeostasis. There are cases when the amount of amniotic fluid is not normal. For example, in the case of polyhydramnios or dihydramnios, there is an excess of amniotic fluid. The normal one would be somewhere around 800 to 1,000 ml of amniotic fluid at 37 weeks. But here, amniotic fluid would be approximately 1,500 to 2,000 ml. In the case of oligohydramnios, there is a decreased amount of amniotic fluid, probably less than 400 ml. Now, both of these are associated with an increase in the incidence of birth defects. One problem of oligohydramnios would be premature rupture of the amnion. The causes of the rupture are actually unknown, but it's quite possible that trauma may play a role here. Of course, because of the premature rupture, there will be preterm labor, and this actually occurs in 10% of pregnancies. In the meantime, cases of clubfoot and lung hypoplasia may also be caused by oligohydramnios. Other birth defects associated with abnormalities in amniotic fluid levels would include central nervous system disorders like anencephaly, or even atresia like esophageal atresia. Because some fetal bloods can escape and cross the placental barrier, there is actually a possibility that these cells will elicit an antibody response by the mother's immune system. If the maternal response is sufficient, the antibodies will attack and eventually hemolyze fetal red blood cells, resulting in hemolytic disease of the newborn. The disease is sometimes called erythroblastosis fetalis because the hemolysis will result to the stimulation of more blood cells to be produced, which are called the erythroblasts. In some cases, however, the anemia becomes so severe that fetal hydrops, meaning edema and effusions, into the body cavity will occur, leading to death, as shown in this image here. One of the more severe cases are actually caused by antigens from the rhesus blood group system, or the D or the Rh antigen. Occasionally, the amnion may tear and it will result to the formation of amniotic bands. If these bands will surround a limb or a digit, it may even cause amputation because of the decrease in blood supply in the area. This figure, for example, shows limb constriction here in this area. And in figure B, the amniotic band resulted to amputation of a digit, and there is also some form of constriction evident in this particular toe. Origin of the bands is most likely due to an infection or even a toxic insult that would involve either the fetus, the fetal membranes, or even both. Bands then form from the amnion, and like a scar tissue, it can constrict into fetal structures. This photograph of a 20-week fetus shows a true knot pointed by the arrow in its umbilical cord. The diameter of the cord is greater in the part closest to the fetus, indicating that there really was an obstruction of blood flow from the fetus in the umbilical arteries and compression of the umbilical vein. And because of this, the knot would definitely cause severe anoxia, meaning decreased oxygen in the fetal tissues and organs, and would be the major cause of the fetus death. So let's see if you can answer this. An ultrasound at 7 months gestation shows too much space in the amniotic cavity. What is this condition and what are the causes? This ends our lecture on placenta and fetal membranes, and until our next video, always remember life is beautiful.